All right, so we're recording. So I would like to first welcome you all to the third annual Intersectionality Conference. My name is Shani Ogilvy, and I'm the outgoing president of SIPA Students of Color, and I will be the moderator for today's panel. We are excited to present this panel discussion on the topic of colorism. The textbook definition of colorism is prejudice or discrimination against individuals with a dark skin tone, typically among people of the same ethnic or racial group. In today's conversation, we'll know that colorism goes far, far beyond that, but I just wanted to say that. In line with the goals of the conference, this topic was inspired to create unity in the things that sometimes physically divide us. From my own perspective, I've seen the way that the color of a person's skin elicits behaviors and attitudes from others. Though this is a topic not often discussed, we were interested to explore why we shy away from speaking about something that has such deep-rooted effects on our lives. Throughout this conversation, we will hear from our amazing panelists that each bring their own perspectives from various cultures and regions of the world to the table. And by the end of this conversation, we hope that people will walk away understanding that beneath the surface, we in fact share many experiences and have community in one another. So to set the tone, in preparing for today's panel, we spoke about how these conversations are sometimes uncomfortable and how sometimes we tiptoe around certain topics, and that can actually make things more awkward. So we invite the awkward discussion and the questions as long as there's respect, love, and good intention in mind. So to begin, I'm going to open up the discussion by calling on our panelists to introduce themselves. So I will first ask Melody Capote. Can you please introduce yourself?
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for being with us. I am Melody Capote, Executive Director of the Caribbean Cultural Center, African Diaspora Institute, located in East Harlem.
Sokona.
Hi, everyone. My name is Sokona, and my pronouns are she and hers. I'm originally from Mali, and I'm an activist, community organizer, as well as social impact consultant who works at the intersection of health equity, community development, and social justice.
Thiago.
Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure and honor to be here. I'm Thiago Amparo. I'm from Brazil. I'm a law professor here at FGV Law School. And I'm also coordinator of the Racial Justice Center, Research Center here in my university. And I'm also a visiting scholar at Columbia, so it's a pleasure to be here.
Christina.
Hi, everyone. My first book. I'm also an advisor for Smashboard, a feminist global digital platform. I was a co-founder of the Dalit History Month project and a volunteer for Dalit Women Fight. My interests are mostly in the politics of identity, diversity and inclusion, mental health, and discourses between caste, gender, religion, race, and sexuality. Lovely to be here. Thank you.
And Hyein.
Hi, my name is Hyein Amber Kim, and I am currently a clinical assistant professor at the University of Buffalo. My research focuses on identity, race, as well as language learning, specifically in Korea and the Korean American context. And I am very happy to be here as well.
So thank you, everyone. So my first question that I'm going to pose to you all is, how do you define colorism in your community, and how does it impact your culture? Could you give an overview of some of the cultural biases and privileges based on skin color that exist? It's a loaded question. So I also want to know personally how it has affected you. And yeah, I'm going to start there. So anyone feel free to jump in.
I'll start. I think we all know that colorism has driven Black beauty standards for centuries. And we know this from it being the determinant of status in society. We know that colorism is a conversation. I mean, it's more and more of a conversation, but in fact, what we do know that these have been conversations that have happened in our own homes, with our own families. As an Afro-Boricua, an Afro-Puerto Rican woman, in my family, we are the rainbow. We are all shade. My mother was a Black woman. My shade is much lighter than my mother was. But the conversations in our own homes about color, marrying light, the children, thinking about the children, has been a very kind of active conversation in many of our families. I mean, I think that would be true of all of us on this Zoom. When you think about the phrase that we use in Spanish, mejorar la raza, better the race, is literally the term that's used when we talk about marrying light and marrying white. And we're very clear that the internalization of these value systems come from colonization. It's the colonial mindset that we all has been imposed on us for centuries. So as an individual, like, how have I seen it? I've seen it in my very own family when we talk about who we date, who we marry, who you have children with, even the preferential treatment that has been, that has occurred in our own families, where you see it. You see the treatment of our own children, of ourselves, with grandparents who say things lovingly, right? There are these terms that are used that are terms of endearment, that ain't necessarily so. When you're referred to in the family as the negrita, the little Black one, and no one else has that type of nickname, we've lived it, and I've lived it. I've seen it in my own family.
If I may, so I agree also what was said just now, but I think that in the Brazilian context, we had to bear in mind first that there's a lot of resistance to talk about colorism, and for a reason. Because for a long time, there was this myth of racial democracy, the idea that, well, here in Brazil, there's no racial conflict because it's not like United States with Jim Crow or with apartheid in South Africa. And this was a myth developed including by state policy, trying to whitening the population, because this idea that, well, because if it's a wider population, it will be a better population, a more civilized or more advanced population. So this was a state policy for a long time, especially incorporated in the Brazilian state in the 30s and in the 40s. This was discussed in academic circles very openly, this idea of a racial democracy, the lack of this open racial conflict. And this was based on the idea of miscegenation, this idea that, well, we are all mixed and that there is no such a thing as a white or Black person. So the Black movements in Brazil struggle for a long time to try to tackle this idea of myth of racial democracy, and to actually bring unity, or at least to put together under the same category as the category of Black people, people from different colors and with different skin colors, but the people that were not considered in the Brazilian context as white. So no white people being a very diverse group in itself. So I think that now people are starting to considering the idea of colorism as a way to understand the nuances within this group of non-white people, and how the discrimination tackles them or impacts them differently. But at the same time, and this is very important in Brazilian context, at the same time not trying to break this political unit or political message that we are all Black people, especially in the Brazilian context, with a very diverse skin colors. And finally, the racism in Brazil is very specifically related to skin color as well, more than you see in other contexts that are much more related to the ancestry. So the whole rhetoric about who is perceived as white and who is not perceived as white, it's very important in the Brazilian context, because it's a very skin color based racism, and this is an important thing to bear in mind as well.
I can jump in because I think both Melody and Thiago said a lot of stuff that I can relate to, but also different for me. I'm from Mali, like I said, and And like, the two places mentioned, Mali is really racially homogeneous, with most people identifying according to ethnicity and ancestry than, let's say, race. So I never grew up with the sense of otherness, right, that happens in the US with racism being so institutionalized. But I did grow up with this idea that certain types of Blackness is better than other, right? And among that being skin color, with people who are lighter skinned, envied for having lighter skin, and those who didn't have it wanting to have it. And one of the ways that we really see that, right, is in language, because language has a strong way of mirroring the culture. For us, if you want to say beautiful woman, when people talk about a beautiful, the first thing is the color of that person. So muso gemma, gemma for us is white. You have that word even preceding the word beauty, right? So that goes to show how skin color is really attached to the word we give a person. And another example that, again, like really relates to melody is when children are born, there's a lot of fanfare that is created around the phenotype of the baby, right? How, you have relatives who comes over and they're there to welcome this new person in a family, including friends. And the comments you often hear is about, the skin color of the child, the type of their hair, the shape of their nose, right? And the more Western their features look, the more this is admired and this is like really highlighted, right? And the more pride the family feel. And these does create like, weird situations. So if you're someone like me, for example, who happens to be born of dark skin to a mother who is fairly light, you're constantly reminded of how unfortunate it is that you didn't take up after your mother. If you're like my middle child who happened to be born light skinned, but tanned, with the African sun, you are told that, oh, it is really unfortunate that you got dark when you used to be so light. And to the point that it's like, you must not be washing right because, melanin is something that you can wash away, though it is sometimes advertised as such. Or if you're my sister, my youngest sister, who, does take up after my mother, you're consistently reminded of, how beautiful your skin look and how lucky you are, to be able to take up after such person. So I think for me, the reason why I bring up these two instances is to show that skin color is a very big thing in Africa, but it operates at a subconscious level, right? Like when people don't really talk about it, but if you listen to the comment and if you listen to who, is praised, you do have the tendency of seeing it being manifested, colorism manifested. And, that has a host of implication when it comes to gender, class, and other social issues.
Perhaps I can go next. One of the things that strikes me, and it did even during our preparatory discussion, Shani, was that how unique each of our contexts are, but also how similar they are. So when Melody was talking about, features, and when Sokona was talking about how it operates on a subconscious level, it reminds me of the experiences that I have gone through. And it is quite similar to how some of these cultures respond to, color differences between each other. Within the Indian context, particularly, I think the best way to answer your question is to go back to this very entertaining Netflix show that some of you might have watched called as Indian Matchmaking that came out last year. And when this show came up, there were like several conversations that were happening around caste and colorism, if you remember. And, a bunch of articles got published and a lot of debates were happening, across social media as well. And for those of you who watched this show, you might remember the matchmakers' clients specifically asking for people who are fair and not dark-skinned, right? That color preference is essentially a caste preference. And so I think I need to take a bit of a detour and explain what caste is before I get into how color works within Indian context. So within not just the Indian context, I must correct myself, but predominantly within the South Asian context, one cannot talk about colorism without talking about caste, which is essentially a social religious hierarchy that still exists in various formats and versions in the subcontinent, as well as among South Asian communities, and that includes communities that live in the US, in Canada, in the UK, across Europe, in Southeast Asia, across the globe, essentially. So wherever you find a fairly high density of South Asian population, caste exists within that population. And I'm sure most of you, you already know that caste is something that's determined at birth. It is rooted in the Hindu religion, but of course, it is now practiced across religions. I'm a practicing Christian, and yet I have undergone caste discrimination within my own community of Christians. And while it is a hugely complex system with subcastes and sects, it predominantly falls under a fourfold system that consists of the Brahmins, which I think a lot of us is more familiar with the Brahmin caste. In fact, when we talk about the Boston Brahmins, that's where the terminology essentially comes from. Brahmins are considered to be the highest caste in India, followed by Kshatriyas, warrior caste, Vaishyas, which are the merchant caste, and Shudras, who are supposed to be people who do labor, but not necessarily menial. Now, outside of this fourfold system are those who are known as untouchables, or lower caste, or Dalits, as we are called today, who are made to do a lot of menial labor and are also, by virtue of that, subjected to extreme discrimination across domains and along different axes, including the color of their skin. So that's how colorism kind of, gets integrated into the caste hierarchy. And I happen to be a Dalit myself. And you asked this question about how has your personal experience been. And I'll probably finish by saying that my experience as a darker skinned Dalit / lower caste person has been that if you look like a Dalit, quote unquote, and I'll get to it in the subsequent questions, is that your journey will be, whether it is towards career, social capital, love, fame, stability, whatever it is, your journey is going to be that much more difficult, that much harder if you look like a Dalit, quote unquote, which essentially translates to a darker skinned person.
And if I may, I think a lot of the points that were brought up previously, there's a lot of overlapping things that you can see in the Korean context as well. One of the biggest things that I think that people have a misunderstanding about of colorism in Korea is the fact that people think that Koreans want to be white, but that's not the case. In fact, historically, if you look at Korean, the different class system, elites usually were indoors, reading books or receiving education, particularly men, Korean men. And that's why they had lighter skin, because they're not out in the sun a lot. Whereas if you're like working class, or if you're kind of the lower level class kind of citizens, then you would be out more doing manual labor, which is why you would have darker skin. And I think historically that has a deep relationship of the view of lighter skin is better versus darker skin is, they're not elite. I think coupled with that is colonialism and the idea of this like kind of Western mindset of like white is better kind of thing. I think it made it like heightened the colorism and racial, especially like with racial stratification within Korea. One of the things I want to point out that I do want to piggyback on Christina's idea is the fact that Koreans are not necessarily, they don't value white as the best. In fact, in the scheme of kind of the pyramid of color, skin color, what's most desired is actually Korean, the Korean skin color. And below that kind of tier, you would see kind of honorary Korean skin color, maybe people who can pass as Korean, like whether they're from East Asian countries or they have a lighter complexion. And then you have kind of the bottom tier of what society thinks as less desired, which is darker. For me personally, because I work in the field of education, I see colorism a lot in public schools. So with the growing multicultural population and a lot of mixed race Korean students in the public education system, you can see the trend that the darker skinned students have a higher dropout rate in public school systems. So they're creating alternative schools under the banner of separate but equal. So a lot of kind of multicultural schools are popping up. Schools for North Korean refugees. They're calling it sometimes special schools as well. But you see that if you have skin color, if students have skin color that are closer to Korean skin color, so a lot of the mixed race East Asian Korean or even white Korean students have a higher success rate of staying within the Korean mainstream public school system. So for me personally, my kind of research and interest is for teacher education too, because teachers also go in with the mindset of a deficit mindset of thinking if the student is of darker skin, immediately that must correlate with their intelligence level or their ability. And that's something I'm passionate about in the Korean context.
Thank you all. Those were, you touched on a lot of the topics that we will be discussing later on in this panel, but I think one of the things that stood out to me was talking about desirable features or Western features sometimes, or not Western features. And I'm wondering exactly how this is the case. Where did we get to this point where there is a system and there are desirable features and features that are not desired? And how did we get here, and where is this behavior learned? I'm interested to know if anyone has any knowledge on the history or the background, or would like to share what they think. I mean, obviously in the United States context, white supremacy, but on a deeper level, how do we break this down? So I can actually, let's say, if you want, Hyein, do you want to start with you and then we go the other way this time?
Yeah, for sure. So at least in the Korean context, the idea of race hasn't actually been explicitly discussed. I think race is a social construct, and the idea kind of like whiteness in the United States, you can see kind of this idea or construct of Koreanness in Korea. And if you look at US history, whiteness also kind of changed to absorb different kinds of white people. And in Korea, what you see is with the growing immigration and growing kind of diversity within the population, this idea of Koreanness is also changing too. So before in the 1990s, there was a government-led training system where there was a lot of Southeast Asian immigrants who came to Korea for training. And then most of them, because they were from Southeast Asian countries, a lot of Koreans, their mindset was, oh, so if they have darker skin, they're here in Korea to learn. So immediately they have kind of looking down kind of mentality. But then in the 2000s, you see a larger influx of immigrant population. And then now you see more of mixed race Koreans. And then as the population gets diverse, so does the skin color. So the idea of who is Korean before might have been someone who's looks kind of like me with just black hair, black eyes, But then now the face of Korea is changing. But there's this struggle between who Korean is and who is defining who Korean is as well. And this is also, you cannot detach it from nation building. It's a social project where the government, after we were liberated from Japanese colonialization, the government, specifically as a nation building project, brought up the idea of race, especially, and heightened it. So the Korean race is best. And the Korean race centered on that, we were rebuilding the nation. That's why there's a very wrong kind of idea that there's a pure blood Korean race. So if any of the mix of different Korean or non-Korean blood, there's a term, 혼혈주의, mixed race. On opposed to that, we call like pure blood, 순혈주의, pure blood Korean. So like this colorism cannot be detached from the idea of race and racial stratification, but also like I think the political kind of who the power behind who shapes this idea, we cannot detach that from the dialogue of colorism in Korea.
So if you're going to go through the statement again, I think your question is more around, where did all of this originate, right? And I think since Hyein raised this question of race within Korea, I think there is definitely a race problem in India as well. We have people who are living in the Northeast. We have the CD communities who are, people that moved from Southeast Africa generations ago. And we have, North Indians and South Indians, and some of us feel we could potentially be ethnically different as well. So I do believe there is a race problem and there are conversations that are happening around it. But I think most of that conversation is predominantly tilted towards caste. And you will see me referring to caste quite often when we are talking about colorism. And while I'm not entirely familiar with the research that is being conducted to understand the origins of colorism within the South Asian context, and our common tendency and our usual thing to do is to blame it on Western colonialism, I have a strong feeling that within India, it has its roots in caste. In my last, during our discussion for the last question, remember I spoke about the fourfold system and I mentioned the 4 different categories, Brahmins and Kshatriyas. So in Hindi or in Sanskrit, it's essentially known as Varna, and Varna literally translates to color. Again, I don't, we obviously need a lot more data on this. And if someone's there on the call who's familiar with this, please do chip in. But I do believe colonialism definitely played a role in aggravating some of these colorist tendencies, like how Hyein mentioned within the Korean context. But I do believe the origins for colorism amongst Indians could primarily be rooted in caste. And that is much older and ancient than colonialism, Western colonialism.
It's me. So I think that because of the way we are presented here on the screen, I'm not sure. So I think that one way to think about the origin of this idea of the beauty and the colorism in Brazil is very much grounded on the violence against Black women during slavery. So I think that one of the ways that our nation and our colleague was talking about the nation building. So one of the ways that the myth of the nation was created, and the birth of the nation in terms of race was very much the idea of racial democracy to deal with the past of massive violence against women, against Black women enslaved, Black women in the Brazilian context. So basically the region of the miscegenation happened there and there is a lot of history showing that, the documents showing that the massive violence against Black women during the slavery and we have to bear in mind that in Brazil we had 300 years of slavery and a massive system of slavery throughout the country. So this is one. So the stereotypes of the over sexualization and their stereotypes around dark skin, especially dark skinned Black women, and also the over sexualization of Black men was very much related with to this origin, with this time, with the colonial time and with the slavery times. So this is one thing that we had to bear in mind. And second is that the interactions between different races in Brazil are very much connected to the social distance that we have nowadays. And I'm not talking about the pandemics, I'm talking about the inequality in terms of economic education, class. And if you look at the map of the city of São Paulo, where I am, and it's a large city like New York, it's a big city. So you see where Black people live there in the city of São Paulo, they live in specific territories in the outskirts. And it's very much, we don't need an official segregation because we already have a de facto segregation in that sense. And I'm mentioning that because the way people interact with each other as equals in society, being love partners or being colleagues at work and at the same level, it's very much influenced by the social distance that we have in terms of opportunities and the factor segregation that we had on the daily life. And this is very much reflected also when we look at, for instance, interracial marriage in the case of Brazil. There is more than 70%, the last data that we have, more than 70% of marriage in Brazil happens within the same race. And it's not only, it cannot only be because of only desire or personal preference, but this personal preference is also influenced by the history of stereotypes against Black people in Brazil, especially Black women. And it's very much also influenced by the de facto segregation that we have in terms of access to resources and opportunities that we have in Brazil. So I think this influences this issue in Brazil.
I want to kind of start off by acknowledging, like I said, Mali is racially homogeneous, but I want to point out that Mali and also all across Africa, we're not a monolithic when it comes to, Africanness. So you have people who come in different colors, different shapes and form and feature across the continent. And that, is very much determined by genetics and by geographical location, depending on, what the evolutionary need where you were located across the continent. So overall, pre-colonialism, there was Africans of all type, and color was seen as something that was normal. I think when the issue arose was, under colonialism, color was co-opted as a way of creating a form of racial ranking. For us, like colonialism was mass marketed as this campaign to civilize a savage. With the more you became like the colonizer, the less savage you were. So that meant skin color. It meant, like education. And it applied to certain phenotypes. So for a lot of Africans under the colonial state, there was a difference between how people were treated, and by displaying certain characteristics that were quote unquote like the colonizer, you were given closer access to the colonial state, and that proximity also meant being closer in terms of social status, being closer in terms of class. So I think an example that illustrates this is the idea of field slave versus house slave in the US, right? Like in colonialism, the same context, the same kind of dynamics applied, where the more you were like the colonizer, the closer you were able to really come in within these circles and be afforded a certain amount of privilege. So that's one aspect. Another aspect is, colonial administrator really used color as a way of ascribing typical Western ideas of hierarchy. So you had different clans and tribes who were afforded several privilege. And this was to create some kind of order, but also to decentralize, different groups, right? Because the more people are breaking apart, the less likely you're likely to arise and like revolt against these really small group of colonial state across the continent. So within that context, there was a lot of instances where this was used as a way of breaking groups apart. And one of the two things that come to mind, right, that are genocide, I'll be amiss if I don't talk about two African genocides on Holocaust Remembrance Day, which is today. We have, what happened in Rwanda between the Tutsi and the Hutus. That was the Hutus. It was a class issue, right? But that was perpetuated under colonialism, because certain group was given more power by colonial master and were allowed to dominate the Hutus. And, you know, if you kind of talk about it in the mainstream, it's like, oh yeah, well, they identify according to like the bridge of their nose, right, and the color of their skin, or how tall they are, and that's kind of how in the street they were attacking each other. But a lot of that had to do with the dynamics that were created and left, you know, by colonizers. I also think about what happened in the Democratic Republic of Congo under King Leopold III, the second. He was the second. There are so many of them. Under who was, you know, Belgian. In that time, about 10 to 15 million Africans were killed, you know, raped and mutilated, who worked on a rubber plantation, right? And the people who worked on a rubber plantation were often people who were darker, right, because they were in a field, and they were seen as brute and intelligent, and you can name it. So in some way, looking like the colonizer afforded you a certain amount of humanity, right? Like just a small amount of safety where at least you were not mutilated or raped on a farm. So that's kind of the context in which a lot of colorism arised in Africa, with, you know, eventually most African believing that the reason for their inferiority was because of their difference from, you know, their colonizer, and the most visible form of that is really skin color, because that's what they use. So you had a lot of Africans who, you know, wanted to become lighter or attempt to kind of accrue some type of racial capital, right? Knowing that that really gave them access to a better life, more privilege, more acceptance and regard in the society. So in the African context, that's a little bit of how colorism came about.
You know, it's been interesting hearing Hyein and Christina's perspective when you talk about caste and class, right? When we here in the diaspora, the African diaspora, and you're talking about the African presence in the Americas, anti-Blackness has always been present. The internal systems that we have in our communities has always been present. The proximity to whiteness and to Eurocentricity has always been revered. And so when you look at communities of color, and I'm going to speak specifically to those of us in the diaspora, that has always been the gauge. I mean, in the South, we had the brown paper bag test, right? If you didn't pass lighter than a brown paper bag, you weren't admitted. And so to speak to the issue of color, caste, class, I think what this conversation has opened up for me, just listening to all of you, and I'm hoping for those who are listening in, is how much work there is to do within our own cultures, in our own countries, in our own communities, and in our own homes. Because I would say that, you know, we are concerned, and I think Shawnee, you and I kind of talked on this when we first met. They, the other, don't have to worry about oppressing us because we're doing it to ourselves. This stratification and this labeling and this way of approaching who we are based on, we are doing this to ourselves. And so in the work that each of you are doing, I think, is it Sokona who's doing some work around bleaching, the bleaching of the skin, right? The relaxing our hair. As children, the pinching of our nose so that we have finer nose and not wide noses, lifting our lips because we don't want what is that? Right? What is that? And so I'm really, really kind of, I didn't know all that Christina and Hyein are sharing about that specific place in the world. But overall, we really are talking about anti-Blackness. And we're talking about the issues of, you know, the internalized hatred, the internalized colonization that we have been forced to live with, whether we're aware of it or not. And so, you know, there's really not much more I can add to what's been shared by the panelists before me, except to say, boy, do we have work to do. and for the work that Hyein is talking about in working with the school system and teachers. I mean, this is the work our organization, the Caribbean Cultural Center, is doing with a school system here in New York City that's primarily of color and still is dictating an agenda, a curriculum that places us as lesser than, right? That you have a curriculum that still speaks in a narrative. We discussed this too in our pre-panel. The narrative we use, we are no longer minorities in this city, state, or country. And if you look at people of color as a whole, we are a majority population in this country. And so the language we use with our children, the language we use when we refer to ourselves, you know, we show up. When you show up, people look at your skin color first. I don't care what you tell me. That's what people see first. And you can be Black Cuban, you can be Black American, however, the African American experience of, you know, the cotton picking South. But how we show up, that is what people see first. And so it's how do we break that mold? And I keep coming back to the root of it being how we start these conversations in our own homes. We've started a series, I don't want to get too far off, but we've started a series of anti-racism trainings that we're doing primarily for white arts and cultural organizations in this city. Why? Because following the killing of George Floyd, my organization was approached as, what do we do? I was so tired of all the messages about standing in solidarity with us. I'm glad they're in solidarity with us, but the action is what's going to speak to how we see change. And so we were approached by over 100 arts and cultural organizations in this city, white-run organizations who were saying, what do we do? What do we do differently? And so we've introduced a series of anti-racism trainings that are really about awareness and asking organizations to take an internal look at their boards of directors, at their staff, at their programming. When and how are they hiring artists of color for their program? For Black History Month? For Hispanic Heritage Month? Or is this become an integral part about how people program, doing what they do? What's happened in these trainings, however, is when they hear me or the facilitator or someone else on the training who is of color speaking to the racism that lives in our homes and hearing these conversations about good hair, bad hair, thin nose, full lips, thin lips, they're surprised that this exists within our own communities. And so I would kind of challenge the conversation we're having now to move us to are we going to be able to resolve this in this panel? Absolutely not, right? I say to the folks taking the training, are you going to be an anti-racist after taking this training with us? Absolutely not. But the work needs to be done. And so, you know, I propose that we really think about the kind of messaging that each one of us here, every little box on my screen, the kind of messaging and the kind of work we're going to do to break some of these conceptions, because it's this isn't new. We know we've, you know, what's it, 500 years of kind of the same conversation, and what shifts it, what moves it, what pivots it, what changes it. I also feel that we're in a moment right now, particularly, I refer to not just the pandemic of COVID, but the pandemics of racism, as well as COVID-19. We're in a moment right now that I see as an opportunity for being able to have this conversation where people are listening. And so, you know, I would say that, you know, based on this conversation and as we move forward, what is the responsibility of each of us to change that conversation and challenge that conversation?
May I say something? Just so I agree totally with you, Melody, because especially when you mention first of all this idea of anti-Blackness, that what we are talking about here and what we are talking about in our own communities and countries is how we are how we are perceived in society. And I see even our own communities, lighter skin Black people like myself, trying to be as white as they can, just to be more accepted to the society. But as Francois will say, well, you wear the mask, but in the end of the day, there's a Black body there. So even with so the racism and colorism is very pervasive, that it even enters our own mindsets and how we see ourselves and how we see our role in society. And even for a very long time, Black people in Brazil trying to change their hair, their skin color, the way they look, their clothes, and everything else, the way they speak, just to be perceived as more acceptable to the society. At the same time, living in a society that says, well, there is no racism, there's a racial democracy and everything. But in the end of the day, just to face daily episodes of racism, that where you notice that, well, it's not necessarily I can do whatever I'm able to do to be perceived differently, but at the end of the day, I'm a Black body in a very racist society. So it's very important to have that in mind, that even within diversity of colors and the different aspects of people that we can think of in our own countries, in our own communities, in the end of the day, there's this anti-Blackness going on all the time that divides the opportunities to access to education. There are how much time a teacher pay attention to you, because whether she or he will consider that you are that will be a brilliant person in the future or not. The job application whether you're going to be perceived or not. And sometimes in a very unequal countries like in Brazil, in other contexts, there are a lot of proxies that you can use you don't even need to look at the person's picture. You can look at their address, you can look at the other aspects where you can identify the person that as a non-white. And it's very interesting that. And finally, one thing about colorism, if you look at the white people in Brazil, one of the things that happen very often is when white people in Brazil travels to the United States, for instance, and they are perceived as Latinos, and they get angry because they like to see themselves as white in our country in Brazil, meaning a privileged caste and in a very unequal society. And they are angry that they are associated with someone that in their own racial mindset is lesser than. So that's very interesting that also we can see this aspect also playing out with the white people from Latin America when they travel around and they are perceived differently. It depends where you are. So I think that I agree totally with you with anti-Blackness, and also the need to think in our own communities how we can change that.
Thank you, Thiago. So you all touched on many different topics that we're going to discuss right now. Actually, you guys spoke about the desirable features. Once again, you guys spoke about assimilation and assimilating to like a colonizer or Western state of mind, and it's like physical state as well, and also about awareness. And I'm wondering how the media is continuing the work and the story and the narrative that colonizers embedded in our communities, and what can we do to change that? I think even thinking about what you said, Hyein, and thinking about what is like Koreanness and what is changing to become like what is the new Korean, and people, the fight that people are having to come to terms that the situation around them is changing. Even in America, it's changing. And so I'm wondering, how does the media continue to do this? Touching into that as well, I want to discuss bleaching. Like, we can't talk about colorism without talking about bleaching. How does the skincare industry also kind of continue along this narrative and these like internal anti-Blackness, this internal like self-hatred that is like destroying our communities? So I know that's a lot, and I don't know who wants to start first. And I would say I want us to have enough time for Q&A from the audience. So I would say for this question, if you can answer in 2 minutes per person, that would be wonderful.
I can start. First, thank you for talking about, the anti-Blackness part of this. And I want to acknowledge like that create trauma, like psychological trauma for the individual of you are trying to do something to look like something that you were not born as. And in the context of skin bleaching, something that I did a research on, skin bleaching, we all know is dangerous. And people know, the participants who do it, they know that it's dangerous. But the reason why they're doing it is not because they hate themselves. No, they're just trying to get that job, trying to find, that mate, that will allow them to marry up. Trying to be seen as somebody who is worthy of like participating in certain things in society, right? And somebody who's looked up to, trying to be somebody who is sophisticated. That's the reason why many people bleach. And right now, the skin bleaching industry is projected to reach 30 billion by 2027, right? And that's a moderate estimation, I will say, right? And the main consumer of that is people in Africa, people in Asia, people in Latin America, where you go outside and all you see are these banners, right, with like lighter skinned people, and selling you this cream, this wash, telling you that if you use this, you will become like them. And you see that everywhere that you go, with a significant amount of it being targeted toward women. And when you ask, does media play a role in this? Media absolutely does play a role in this. If you look at the actors, that are higher, right? Like they often tend to be people who are lighter. If you look at who make it in the industry, they often tend to be lighter. I think the rapper Izzy, pronouncing her last name wrong, Azealia, like at some point came out and she said she was bleaching, right? And it was such a fanfare here in the US. And she said, well, that's what we need to do. It's akin to getting a nose job in Hollywood if you want to make it. And if you look at the movies, right, like Games of Thrones, who are the savages? Who are the slaves, right? And that's across like Indiana Jones, right? And even Bollywood movies, which I grew up watching, like who were always seen as the evil, the monsters, right? And this does have a psychological impact on people who are dark, but it also does have a psychological impact on viewers who are non-dark. So it's easier for a police officer to say, oh yeah, that guy, I shot him because he looks scary, or a woman in Central Park calling the police and saying, I feel threatened. Or even if in our school system, a child of dark skin getting kicked out, we have kindergarten being expelled, right, for their behaviors, right? Because Black children, when they act like a child, they're seen as rowdy, they're seen as obtrusive, they're seen as something is wrong with them, and they're criminalized. And oftentimes too, what does that do? Like you have that child who will opt out for a lighter doll versus a darker one if given the option. So overall, it is maintained and perpetuated by society, with media being one of the main instruments, right? That really, I will say, like fan the flame.
Perhaps I can add to that what Sokona had mentioned, and thank you, Sokona, for mentioning about Bollywood movies. Well, things in India are very similar with respect to both bleaching creams, fairness creams, as well as pop culture and who gets to be seen and who is visible in pop culture. You may have heard about a cream called as Fair and Lovely that is quite popular in India. It hit the markets in 1970. My auntie still uses it. And very recently, last year, Fair and Lovely kind of said, Unilever said that they would rename the cream as Glow and Lovely, but the marketing campaign and the constitution of the cream, the composition of the cream, everything would remain pretty much the same in essence. You aren't essentially trying to get away from anti-Blackness or being anti-dark skin. Rather, you're just kind of packaging it in a different sense. I don't think the fairness industry within India has moved too much. I think pop culture, which includes movies and advertisements, marketing campaigns, all remain the same. Bollywood actors, not to mention Priyanka Chopra herself, who is considered to be brown and dark skin, but that is only in comparison to American whiteness. Back home in India, and Priyanka Chopra incidentally had, endorsed one of those creams, though she had apologized later on. So several of these Bollywood actors have endorsed fairness creams quite, actively. And this, like Sokona said, has had an impact on all of us who happen to be dark skinned. But since Melody also spoke about, what changes are we looking at, I do want to give credit to some of the changes that are happening on social media, particularly dark-skinned women in my location that is from South Asian origins, but who are geographically located elsewhere, such as Malaysia or Canada, Elam Tamil women, Malaysian Tamil women, who are all dark-skinned and who have taken on social media to kind of just re-author this discourse on colorism. And the fact that they are able to so confidently put themselves out there has made a lot of change in the way I see myself and the way I see my own people. So I do believe change is happening, and I do believe there's a lot of potential for more change to come. But perhaps this conversation is one of those many things that will have to take place and is taking place.
I'm going to flip this just slightly, and thank you for that, Christina, because that's exactly, I was hoping that it would open up exactly that. The images that we're seeing, right, were typically the images we had on the covers of magazines and on television were always white, and that's what we were to aspire to. And we're seeing how, even with our own publications and our own productions, and even when you mentioned the matchmaking program, the television program, you're beginning to have those conversations where typically that would stay behind closed doors. Those were just not things we discussed.
Right.
But wanting to flip it, the fact that we are a rainbow people, that we can come in many different sizes and colors, we don't have the privilege to take on the role, no matter how light we are, of being white. And yet we've had individuals like this woman Rachel Dolezal, who decided to pass for Black, right? And was the head of the NAACP. Most recently, there was another woman, Natalia, who decided she was going to be Latina and be part of the Puerto Rican Legal Defense Fund. The wife of Alec Baldwin, who's claiming a Spanish ancestry that nobody can really attach her to. So even in looking at choices, right? To Thiago's point, right? That coming to this country from Brazil and being identified as Latino, and that puts that person in the category of lesser than, because in Brazil, they were not Latino, right? Even now, when we speak down to the number of young people in particular who are identifying with being Afro-Latino, the center's work for 44 years, 40 years ago, we were talking about being Afro-Latino. Afro who? What? That Afro identity before being Latino or Hispanic. Someone please explain to me where Hispanic is, because I'm not Hispanic. But, right, even those little terms, and I keep coming back to language and narrative because it's just so important. I will say I'm Afro-Boricua, I'm Afro-Puerto Rican before saying I'm Latina. I want you to know where I'm from. I want you to know that I'm Puerto Rican, right? This issue now of using terms like Alana and BIPOC. What is a BIPOC? Black, Indigenous people of color? I'm supposed to identify as BIPOC? You're kidding me. Alana, which is actually was born through the university system. It's something like African, Latin American, Native American, and Arab. In Alana, we're supposed to figure that out. Identity and being able to claim who you are and where you're from is key. And I come back to, we don't have that privilege. We don't have that entitlement of being able to say no matter, and I will say, my mother being Black and my brother, my mother being Black Puerto Rican and my brother being a lot darker than I am, married a white Puerto Rican woman from the mountains of Puerto Rico, blonde, blue-eyed, white skin. My nieces, one is dark, the other one is light. Same mother, same father, same grandmother. We have a term in Spanish that says, ¿Y tu abuela dónde está? And your grandmother, where is she? Yes, I see you, Melody. I see you. Right? We have a phrase that says, ¿Y tu abuela dónde está? Where is your grandmother? Because somewhere in your lineage, and you ain't got to go back 500 years, somewhere in your lineage, there is an African influence as well as the indigenous influence, as much as you always want to claim being Spanish. And so, you know, what I use the examples of Rachel Dolezal and these other individuals because they chose to identify as Black, not being Black at all. And yet we in this spectrum, my niece, who's also blonde, blue-eyed like her mother, could never claim to be white, would never be accepted as white. And so these are, again, these are just things that when we talk about what is the media is exposing a lot of things too that might not otherwise have been put before us, right? And so social media, the platforms that we're all using, what is, you know, folks go to Facebook and it's like, you know, don't believe everything you see on Facebook. People, you know, they're fronting, it doesn't, this is true, but it's also an opportunity to be able to put out to a very broad general public the truth about who you are, because you can't talk about everybody else if you can't identify and talk about your own truth. The truth about who you are, and again, everything that's been shared here, being able to use that platform to educate and inform, break the molds, right? And break the concepts that have typically been associated with who we are, which is always, you know, the Black, the dark, the ugly, the, and so on down the line.
Shani, is it okay if,
sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to add a quick comment to Melody when she was listing all of these different checkboxes, right? It's like white supremacy is still trying to figure out what type of Black we are, right? And what type of person of color we are, right? And we see that in our institutions because it is used to determine what we're allocated. If you think about school, because they have a certain spot for us, right? If you fit into this group, that means you get into that. And that is so problematic because nowhere in those census, or you don't say, oh, are you Polish white, right? Like, because those were often also had its own history. So even today, we're still being categorized into groups and subgroups to be able to determine our worth and like also what we deserve and how much of us are there in society. And that does not, white people are just simply white people. And I wish that same amount of just like acknowledgement of like you just exist because of the way that you're born was afforded to the rest of us. So we don't have to worry about checking a box about where we fit in when sometimes we don't even know because some people were brought from different places against their own will. So they don't even have that privilege to be able to trace their lineage because it's been so messed up. So that's just as you were thinking, as you were listing those, like that's something that came into mind and, you know, is often not talked about.
I also see that as a divisive way of keeping us separate, right? Because if we can't, you have white and everybody who wants to identify with white coming from wherever can lump themselves as white, but we can't just be Black, right? And then you have these subcategories that then group us and then sometimes position us against one another, right? I'm still doing some work on this, but I was reading the other day about the model minority, who were the Asians that came into this country. And they didn't fit being minorities as we were seen. They were the model minority and were brought in actually as already educated and professionals. They came in with certain professions, so they come to this country not having to kind of scramble from the bottom. And that too then becomes something to aspire to be. If we couldn't be up here, at least can we get here and get that kind of preferential treatment so you know, positioning us that way is always kind of putting us in this at odds, which, you know, I'm saying we need to break that model and just kind of look at it from a different lens.
I would say, Melody, yesterday we had a panel by Professor Yumiko, who was actually speaking of the model minority and Asian Americans who were in this country, but also the divisiveness that is used in that they are the model minority, but at the same time, they are the first to get hired for economics and like jobs, but also the last to get promoted to be in a high level position of power. So I think it's all devices, it's all devicism, like to separate us and to make us believe, oh, well, this is the model person, but then still this person is still having their own struggles of not being able to reach to the top. So I want to hear from Thiago and then Hyein. So Hyein, you can go first.
Sorry, I feel like the discussion was so good, but I'm going back to your question of the media.
No.
I just wanted to, since K-pop these days is so big, I wanted to touch a little bit upon K-pop and colorism that we see in the K-pop industry. So since I think the late 1990s, early 2000s, there's been what we call the Korean wave, where there's the Korean culture kind of increasing its popularity and influence around the world. It started to be big in East Asia, but now you see boy bands like BTS, like worldwide, gaining popularity. But because K-pop has been growing in popularity worldwide, the tactics of how they form K-pop groups have also changed. So before it was only all Korean members, but now they're adding like a foreign member or a mixed race member. But still to this day, it's very hard to see a darker skinned K-pop boy band or girl group member within the band. And in media in Korea, there are more representation of darker skinned mixed race Koreans or darker skinned like population in Korea. But at the same time, like what kind of positions and what kind of industries they're in are something that we should keep questioning. For example, in Korea, like half Black, half Korean individuals, there are some who are in the music industry, and there are some basketball players who are very popular, but still the areas they're in are limited to music and sports. And only recently, there was one very popular half Black, half Korean, younger 18-year-old Korean model, which like Koreans came to really love. But I think the Korea is still at a point where you need to question, not only is there enough representation, but what roles are people playing? What kind of industries and areas are they in within that representation, and how are they being represented as well? So I think I'll leave my kind of note on there, but I just wanted to bring it back to your question about media.
So I thank very much, Hyein, right? If I'm not sure I'm saying your name correctly, but I like very much your last point because that's what I wanted to say. Because besides the fact that we have all these stereotypes in media and who can be seen in media, recently there was research showing that more than 70% of the people in advertisement in Brazil are white. Even on a population more with the majority of Black people. So Black women, only 4% of the advertisement in Brazil, and Black men around 6%. So in a country where we are the majority. So this is it's not only, it's first is the question of who is seen and who is there, but also personally for me is also a question of when we manage to get there and to be in those places, being a media, being a news channel or something like this, being an expert in university, what roles we are allowed to play. I have I'm a law professor, and I have a Black student, they ask me, can I study something that is not racism because it's not actually exactly something that I want to study. I want to study, I don't know, economics. And I said, yeah, you can study other things. And personally, the feeling that I have is that when I manage to enter the media and to be able to give interview in a news channel, commenting topics on the news, I often I'm called to talk about racism, which is one of the issues that I study. But also I teach international law. And then recently there was discussion about international law on TV, and I was there And then I receive a lot of comments from people saying, well, that's great to see a Black person commenting about other things. And this is to say that sometimes when we are allowed to enter those places, we are allowed to play a role of someone who only knows about its own experience, while white people know by knowledge, because they are universal beings and they can know anything. No one white person comes to a media and say, because I'm a white law professor, I understand law in that way. And this is something that is expected from Black people, and I've experienced that a lot. Not only the inequality when you are in those places, but also how you're treated in those places, not as equal as a white person in those places.
And so thank you so much, Thiago. And I think I wanted to open it up to questions now. We have one question which I will address because it's actually our closing call to action. But before I address that, I will take the question from Lashana, who is a former SSOC board member. So welcome. And her question, actually, I'll call on her to ask her question herself. So Lashana, you can unmute yourself.
Good evening, everyone. This popped up on my Instagram feed, and here I am. It's very timely for me because we are getting ready to go into Black History Month here, and it's one of the challenges that the Black officer leads the charge to do these programs, because of course we don't trust anybody else to do it right. One of the challenges is, it's a predominantly Black population here in Angola, but as Thiago, I think you may be able to speak to this from the Brazilian perspective, but there has not been quite that level of recognition of the impact of Portuguese colonization here. And so I would be rich if I had $1 for every time someone made sure that I knew that they had Portuguese heritage, as a way to make them more favorable in some way. So it's a challenge, and I don't want to. I think that it's something that needs to be infused into our programming in some shape or form, but I'm having trouble thinking about like how deep that is, because even I'm coming from an American perspective, I'm coming from as a Caribbean American perspective, I don't even have it figured out. So how to engage on that in a meaningful way, and is it worth it? Is there another way to enter that conversation to identify any similarities between our experiences or identify useful observations in a modern day context. So super complicated question, but it's something that is burning in our minds as we get ready.
May I respond or? Okay, because Shani was not saying anything. I was like, oh, should I say? So thank you very much for this question. It's very interesting. And I think that, first of all, historically, we have to bear in mind that most of our history was written by the people who were privileged by the colonization. And this is not only an overstatement, it's a fact, because most of the universities and not first was not universities, was faculties, the schools were, especially law schools and medicine schools, were established and by the time of the colonization and the beginning of the independence of the country that we know now as Brazil. So it's really interesting that sometimes the history that we have nowadays and the problems that we have nowadays, sometimes we don't date back to that time. So one example is policing. Policing was established by the royal family when they moved to Brazil, and basically the idea was to protect the property of the royal family and also to catch slaves. So when we talk about racism now in the policing, we also had to go back to the colonial times and how the influence of the colonial time. And I think that we have a lot to do in terms of I'm not a historian myself, but we have a lot to do in rewriting this history and challenging the myths that we created to understand this history. One myth is that, well, Portuguese colonization was not as bad as the Spanish colonization, so we are not that bad. Or another myth is that we are all, at the end of the day, we loved everyone, and we are mixed countries, so it's a racial democracy, so it's not that bad. So we love Black people, we love the history, we love the music, we love the religion, so it's not that bad. So this myth that we created is also trying to mask our history and not face it as it is. So I think that even nowadays, recently, a few weeks ago, the president said there is no racism in Brazil, and the vice president said that. So even after 300 years of slavery, so that's really understanding the roots of the colonial roots of that. And I think that's one way to do that is to look at the history and try to trace the problems that we have nowadays, also their colonial roots. And I think that will move things a little bit forward in that way. And I think one way to do that is to also look at the other Latin American countries, Spanish colonized countries, that they were they talk more about the history of the colonization. They challenge the genocide against indigenous people. So I think that's we have to learn a lot with our colleagues with our neighbors, and I think that's very important.
Thank you so much, Thiago. I would also say that, especially what you're saying about Portugal and the involvement of Portugal, I think people don't know, and I'm pretty sure Portugal built the slave ships. Like, they were primarily involved in building slave ships. So I think when people do want to think that, it's not that bad, they weren't that involved, it's like, of course, the people who are the most involved are in the background. So I just want to point that out. And so now we are running out of time, but I want to allow Lily to ask her question, which is our closing question. So Lily, could you unmute yourself and ask your question, please?
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Lily. Thank you for this amazing panel discussion. So something that I struggle with personally is kind of reconciling with the group of people that always say, well, it's not my job to educate other people on matters of colorism or race. And it just frustrates me so much because, like, obviously that would be great, but we don't live in that world. So, and like, how can we expect to make any type of like real or even incremental change if we don't kind of take upon the responsibility of doing it in our own personal context? So how do you even, because for me, like I said, I would check someone. I don't care who they are. I don't care where we are. Like, I will let them know. So I just don't understand how to reconcile that, how to be understanding and compassionate about that.
When we chose to do these anti-racism seminars, I got such pushback from my staff, members of my staff, to the point of someone quitting on me. Because the point they were making was the center's work has been about empowering and lifting African descendants. That's our constituency, that's our base, that's our membership, that's who we're working for. And so the pushback I got from some staff members, not all of them, was, it's not our job to educate white people on racism. While I may stand with that, I'm going to come back to my point earlier where I said, I think there's an opportunity right now, this moment, where if we're not at least having the conversation, they'll either get it wrong or won't do anything about it. And then we're pointing fingers because nothing's changed, right? So much of what we know about, and particularly looking at everything that we've learned throughout our lives, has been through a Eurocentric lens. Whether we agree with it or not, whether we agree with the education we've received or not, whether you're sitting in Columbia University or a city college, everything we've learned has been through this Eurocentric lens. And that's been imposed on us, right? How do we not now flip it and kind of impose our history, our information, looking at the world through the lens through the Afrocentric lens to inform and educate. I'm with you, Lily. It's like, if I have to call you on your shit right there on the spot, you're getting called. If I've got to inform you and educate you, I'm going to take the moment to do that. Is that everybody's job? Is that our job? No, I mean, probably not. But in addition to doing that, I then look to see and hold folks accountable. So it's not the pow, at least those that are close to me and are asking my opinion, or who are coming out, who I need to check. Right? So it's about accountability as well. Does that happen in an instance where I see some kind of a behavior in a restaurant that I'll never see the person again? Maybe not. But I don't know to say that it's our responsibility to do so. I do feel, though, that we're in a moment right now where there is a level of allyship that we're seeing from others. We see it in the protests, right? You know, and when we speak about the protest and we talk about the moment, it's like, look at how everything has quelled and died down, and it's almost until the next. And we all don't want this next to happen, but it's until the next. And then you start kind of rallying folks. So I'm of the school that, while I know who my constituency and my loyalties lie with first, there is also an opportunity and a responsibility, I feel, to educate and have the conversation and hold others accountable. But that's my own personal view.
Yeah. Christina?
Yeah, so I wanted to say that, you know, as somebody who's been part of these very arguments and conversations, not just within the global context, but primarily within the Indian context, you know, we also tend to say these very things, although within the Indian context, you don't necessarily identify as a person of color, but more like Dalits versus, you know, the dominant Savarnas or dominant upper caste. And these kind of statements keep coming up as to, it's not my job to educate you. Now, I do believe that this is an important moment, and it's really important that we continue to have discourses and conversations that are working towards awareness building, getting people to think differently. And I think there's been a lot of work that has already been done in the past. So there is value to the work that we do. But I think we can also take a moment to appreciate how diverse we are as individuals, right? Like, some individuals might think that, hey, it's not my job. They might be too tired. They might be too bored. They might just not feel like it to do that kind of an education. And I think that's absolutely fine. I think there's some value to also appreciating that individual diversity, that all of us are different people. The secondly, and more importantly, that I also wanted to mention as part of our earlier conversation is to, when it comes to such discussions, we have to be aware how white-centric and whiteness-centric some of these discussions become, right? So when we say, and I notice this because people of color are saying in relation to whiteness within the American context, they're saying, hey, I'm not going to educate you. The same thing gets replicated within the Indian context too. So there's just so much of that shared behavior that gets imitated, that goes around. Like, it makes me feel like as though whiteness is the only dominant force that this entire world is fighting. But in reality, that's not true at all, because we are all very different in our regional context. And I go back to, you know, what Hyein keeps saying, and we did discuss about this in our preparatory conversations, how in our individual, regional, and community context, our oppressor takes on a different role and a different avatar, so to say. So I think there's also some truth to seeing this conversation as more expansive and more diverse rather than just white versus POC. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, I don't want to sound like the devil's advocate, but I want to say it's really important to extend people who are exhausted some type of compassion, because, you know, it is, they do have a point. It is not your job to teach somebody, you know, the importance of recognizing the humanity in everyone, right? Especially in a society where you are constantly having to deal with the emotional, psychological, physical toll of, like, what that means when you are put at the bottom and you're treated as such. That is exhausting. And people are dealing with that reality, so that when you add on top of that saying, well, you need to be responsible for your own salvation, right? And or making these people change, it's a lot for folks to absorb, particularly also if you look at history, you know, protests have been happening for how long, right? Nothing has changed. So there is a point where people are feeling tired and they're feeling exhausted. And that sentiment of it is not my job and I shouldn't have to do it is absolutely valid. But I will say there is it is your job to learn your own personal history, right? So thinking about how throughout your life, who your people were, what they did, because history often is what happened to you and what you did. And oftentimes white people have the tendency of talking about their history in terms of their accomplishment, which put them in a position to say, all right, we are obviously better than all of you and need to dominate and make you all of like us, because look at all of the amazing thing that we did. Whereas for people of color is all of these trauma that happened to you is really your history. So as an individual, it is, you know, your role to learn your own history and learn some of those internalized racism that you have done, right? Because that allows you to withstand walking in a world that is constantly reminding you that you're not enough. And I will say, you know, it is also the job of allies and you know, non-allies who are not in it to learn their own history as well, and to learn how through culture, through how they were raised, they have adopted implicit biases, because nobody is born a racist, right? Like it is something that you're learned. And you know, if someone can rush to the Capitol on Jan 6 and did what they did, they grew up in the same society that you did. So therefore, that means that you have adopted some of the beliefs that they have, even if it's not to an extreme. And the only way that you can be an ally is to learn where that came from. So when people do show up in the street, when they do protest, when they do demonstrate, you're willing to walk with them. And also you're willing to allow a space for those systems, those barriers that have been created to keep those people down and give you privilege to be lifted. So we need to really acknowledge, right, like the environment where people are working in, and understand that it's really nuanced, and it is, everyone has a individual role, right? And we shouldn't anticipate one specific group of people to teach another person, another beings, another individual, another collective how to acknowledge their humanity when they don't even have the space to like talk and exist, right? So that's kind of what I wanted to add to the discussion.
Thank you, Sokona. Hyein?
I absolutely agree the importance of, you know, allies, because even when you're going through your own individual like journeys and challenges, when you see other people who are also fighting for the same cause, it kind of gives you kind of some, I guess like refreshing encouragement every now and then. I do think that I believe in the power of one though. And I remember my professor, when I was telling him, when I was kind of starting my, you know, work in racism and colorism in Korea, that this feels really lonely. Like there's nobody really talking about this. There's nobody really researching this. And yet I'm the one who has to problematize it and also have all these other mainstream Korean people understand. Like, and what I felt was like a moving belt, like a conveyor belt, but I was trying to go the opposite way. And I like constantly, there's one direction the society is going through and I'm trying to go the opposite way. But I remember my professor saying the power of one is so strong. And I remember him telling me a story where there's a little child at the shore who kept throwing the clams that kind of washed onto the sand back into the water. And the father asked, why are you keep on throwing these seashells and clams back into the water? And the child said, even though there's many, many hundreds of clams that might die on the sand, I can save one by throwing it back into the water. So I always remember that story when like I find challenges and discouragements in my own kind of research and work in race and colorism. I do really believe the power of one, and you don't know the next person you'll be touching and you will influence to do this work as well. So I just wanted to throw that in.
Thank you so much. Thiago.
Well, everyone said everything, but I just want to say that I think it's very. I just want to stress the idea that someone said already before that it's very important to have this conversation, and probably you're not going to change things when you don't have this conversation with the white people. But also we had to bear in mind that it's not about white. It's not about them and as such, and in the sense that it's not. It should not be centered to the sensibilities of white people. So in the sense that we should be able to shake them to understand their own privilege and to not only understand it, but also to change it. Because one of the things that I heard from, especially from white people that are woke, is that, well, I say something and then they start saying about structural racism and privilege and whiteness and critical whiteness and all these things. And so they know much more than I do. And then they use this also as a privilege to navigate these racial inequalities and racial privilege, because if they know things up front, they don't need to go into uncomfortable conversations about their own privilege. And so sometimes I see racial learning from white people as a way to deal with the white privilege instead of challenging it. And so I think it's very important that it's a knowledge in order for us to act, to do something, to change things. And in order to change things, they also had to not only understand, but also to change their own privilege, and not use racial knowledge as another way to navigate privilege. So I think that's the important thing, and also we always have to bear in mind that we are here in order to change the structural things, and we are not going to do that without everyone on board. And I think that's very important to speak with each other and understand each other, but also bear in mind that we want to change things for the people who are being not privileged in our societies.
Thank you so much, Thiago. So this conversation has been so colorful and so informative to myself and to many of the attendees and the guests who have come today. And of course, this conversation could go on forever. We could talk about so much, but unfortunately, time is not on our side. So I would like to close this out today by thanking all of our panelists for attending and giving them a round of applause. And that we will end today's session. So thank you all for joining. I encourage you to attend the other events happening in the Intersectionality Conference this week. And that's how we'll end today. Bye, everyone.
Happy birthday, Shani.
Thank you.
Happy birthday.
Happy birthday.
Thank you, everyone.